Very good. The chairperson of the Program Planning and Events Committee is Craig Patterson, sorry. Membership Outreach Committee is Cassandra James. Communication Website Technology is Sandy Curry. The Great Decisions Forums is Judy Potter. Student Civic Scholarship Program is Alice Freed. And our Bay Area League representative and a member of the Bay Area League Board, in addition to being our secretary currently, is Danielle Kreider. So if you have any questions about any of those committees, then there is a lot going on. For example, we have redistricting that's coming up, and there's going to be plenty of opportunities to make a difference in the body politic this year with our redistricting. So that's going to be handled mostly through voter services. Right now, though, Judy Potter is going to present the budget. And if you're ready, Judy.
Yeah, I just had to unmute myself. I forgot it was muted. Okay. There's a copy of the budget proposal and sorry, I've got the whole budget in the back. And I'm just going to mention a couple of highlights here. Please forgive the fact that I seem to have typed that this was the budget proposal for 2020 and to 2021, and it's obviously for 2021 to 2022. So please note that. And just really briefly, the budget is very similar to last year's budget. I've tweaked a few little things. Our membership numbers look like they've gone down a tiny bit, so I've decreased that. We won't be doing a election for the Crockett Community Foundation this year, which usually brings us in $1,000 to $1,500 every other year. We got it this year, so we won't have it next year. So I decreased our donations. And we've not been getting too many donations to the education fund, so I decreased that also. Post office box rental went up a tiny bit. Great Decisions has gone up a tiny bit. Member payments have gone down a little bit since I think they'll go down a little bit since we have fewer members. But most of the committees fell well below their budgeted numbers for last year. And some of the committees spent absolutely nothing. So photo services program, membership, state and national convention, and our fundraising committees are all being given the same budgets they had last year. And remember, the budgets are just suggestions. If we make more money, great. If we spend a little more, we have some money in reserve, so we're doing okay. So if anybody has questions, I'm happy to take them now. Don't forget, I always say this with budget, pay your dues. If you haven't paid it recently, Sandy and the membership committee have set up a system where they're letting everybody know a month or two ahead of the due date for their dues. You can pay at the anniversary of your joining, or you can pay now around the membership meeting time, whichever works best for you. And it's $70 for members and $105 for 2 members in a household. And I'm happy to take any questions. No questions? Such a trusting group.
Sounds good. All right, great. So we will vote to adopt the proposed budget.
Good. It's got the correct years on it. That's good.
Yeah, we got that. Except there's a little we replaced one error with another one.
Great.
Oh, there's Claudine. Hello. Okay, we've got, we can end the polling, I think, and share the results. Great. Next, so that motion has been passed. The budget was approved. Next will be the program recommendations for 2021-2022.
Now bylaws.
No, well, is that what's on there?
Yeah, bylaws report is next.
Yeah, I tried to move that around, but in one place I've got it in one way or another. All right, so we'll do the bylaws. The The proposal is to amend the bylaws to increase the number of elected directors from the current 4 to 6, thereby establishing the board of directors as consisting of 4 elected officers, 6 elected directors, and up to 4 appointed directors, and to change these to modify the no more than 2 directors may be elected in even numbered years and no more than 2 directors may be elected in odd numbered years. Change that to no more than 3 directors in even numbered years and no more than 3 directors may be elected in odd numbered years. So can we get a vote on the proposed bylaws amendment?
Niles, you have a question from Gail. Why
Gail,
are we
yes.
proposing the increase?
The rationale for doing that was that an awful lot, currently there's been a lot of work that the board has undertaken that in the context of this expansion countywide. And as a practical matter, most of the work has been initiated by board members. And there was just not enough bandwidth with the board that we had to do all of the things that needed to be done. So we wanted to increase the board size by 2 to allow for more person hours to support this expansion. As the committee structures get stronger and more developed, the need for the board to be doing a lot of the work should be decreasing, and more of it should be carried by the committees themselves. But at the moment, a number of the committees are relatively new and don't have a culture and a history and a membership, a constituents. See, so that's the logic. Is that clear?
Niles, may I add also, we
Yes.
had a governance study group, and as part of that group, in exploring ways to distribute the power and responsibility within the group, the recommendation was to increase. This is with our liaison who participated in that conversation, that this was going to broaden our base in order to be able to more efficiently carry out the work. Each director will have an area of focus, although they may not be the leader of that particular group. They will have a focal point that they will work, that will direct their work. And the goal there is then to recruit people from the league to help work together with each director in order to carry out the work. So I see your concern, Gail, about more work for the director and less for the membership, but the intention is exactly the opposite. So we'll see, hopefully that will happen.
Thank you. Any other questions about that? You can, if you have a question, stick it in the chat there and we'll. No. Clock is winding down. Here we go. Attendees are now viewing the poll results. Very good. All right. So that amendment was passed unanimously. Next is program recommendations for 2021-2022. Craig Patterson oversaw a process to, well, actually, I'll let Craig explain it. It was very nice. It was, in fact, future years, it'd be nice to see more of this. Anyhow, Craig, over to you.
Okay, just briefly, there's a lot of information in the written report, but one of the things that we did differently this year was that we did an outreach program into the community in order to have input into our priorities, so that it wasn't just our group of members, but members of the community who could help to inform us about what the community's priorities are. So we did some outreach, and we had well, not as many people responding as we would like, but we had a significant addition of information that came from the community. We used that information then as part of our data in choosing how we discussed our priorities, and I think we benefited tremendously from it. So in order to kind of feed into our our process. I'd like to share my screen, and I have a little bit of an overview of how we're going to be addressing our program priorities. Okay, well, those are our proposals. And Niles, I believe you were wanting to lead a discussion prior to our voting.
Well, just to give people an opportunity to ask questions if they had any.
Okay, so the floor is open.
I mean, if there are no questions, we can proceed to a vote. Okay. We'll pop that up on the screen. There we go. Well, looks like that the program priorities for 2021-2022 have been approved as proposed by the committee. So very good. They're adopted. And then I just want to check with Craig about. All right, share the results. Did we?
Sorry, I took them down, but 32 individuals voted for it, 0 against.
Very good. Okay, great. So those are adopted. So moving right along to the election of the new board. So the report of the nominating committee Rami, would you like to introduce that?
Yes, be my pleasure. The nominating committee, it consisted of Marianne Perlmutter and Barbara King and myself. And we worked together to try to create a slate of candidates that will fill the various offices for the coming year. Those positions are being proposed at this time, and we will, of course, accept nominations from the floor should there be any interest in doing so. You will notice on the document that was included in terms of for the slate of candidates, that the candidates are being nominated for 2-year terms, and in one case for a 1-year term, and that would be mine as vice president. And that's because I'm filling the role of Julie Hartford, who is now because she has moved. So in order to keep with our current sequence where the president and the secretary are elected in 1 year, and the vice president and the treasurer in a subsequent year, that's why this particular year, that position would be for only 1 year. So for president, Carol Patterson. Carol, raise your hand. I am being nominated for vice president. Secretary, Kathleen Savage. Kathleen is on my screen on the bottom. Thank you, Kathleen. Of course, Judy would continue as the treasurer for another year. And then the directorships that are open are Craig Patterson for a 2-year term. His would be on events and program. That would be his area of focus. Cassandra James be working on on membership. Marianne Perlmutter focusing in the area of voter services. And Danielle Kreider would be a director at large with no particular area of focus. And then we have people that are continuing for the next year, and they're not on the ballot, but just so that we're aware of the total team. Sandy Corey is continuing as the director, as is Alice Reed. Also, the proposed nominating committee for 2021-2022 would consist of myself, Marianne, Ali Desiderio, I see her on the screen. Thank you, Ali, and Jennifer Lawley Pettit, and she would be the 4th member. Questions and any potential nominations from the floor? Danielle?
All right, to the vote. So this is a vote to approve the slate as presented, right?
Excuse me. I have a question before we vote.
Go ahead.
This is Sarah. At what point will you be taking nominations from the floor? And will you be calling each position individually in order to do so?
I think we just asked for nominations from the floor and didn't hear any response. And we did make a call via the email announcement for the annual meeting, asking for any nominations to be submitted by email as well. I don't know, you have more about that, Rami?
That's correct. And if there, we can certainly entertain them right now, Sarah. So if you know of people and for any of the offices that are listed.
No, it's not. No, I'm not interested, and I don't know of anyone. It's just that that's the protocol that I've known for years. That's followed anytime you have election of officers. You take them one at a time, and then you see if there's if there's a nomination from the floor, and then you close it, and then you move on. What has taken place today was you went, even though we received information prior to the meeting. However, the only mention today was, here's the slate, and now we're voting. So that was just a question I had. Thank you.
Okay.
You want to direct it to our parliamentarian? Yeah, I think historically what we're doing today is consistent with what we've done historically, but that doesn't mean it's consistent with Robert's Rules of Orders. I think the fact that we made the request for any nominations other than those presented by the nominating committee. We made that request via email over the course of the last 30 days. Should have ensured that there was an opportunity for people. Any other questions before we proceed with the vote or continue?
There was a question in the chat about the number of
Yeah,
people
number of people.
on the nominating committee.
Why is there an even number? It says.
I'm not sure about
The
that.
bylaws, to my knowledge, did not specify a specific number.
Right. I can look and see.
The Article 8 says the nominating committee shall consist of at least 3 members, one of whom shall be a member of the board of directors.
Right.
So I don't see anything that limits the number or requires that it be odd or even.
Right. Thank you. Okay. So Danielle, can we have the, yeah, thanks. So that's, we have 100% vote. Okay, good. So we're done with that. Great. So the slate as proposed was approved. Terrific. And would you believe it?
We did it, Niles. Good job.
The time, let me just zoom back up to the top.
Can't believe it.
Hold on. Okay. Yes. Well, the new board. Let's just say who the new board is for the record, and then we will turn it over to Rami and Claudine. So the new board, the president of the board will be Carol Patterson. Vice president will be Rami Muth. The treasurer will be Judy Potter. Secretary will be Kathleen Savage. Elected directors will be Craig Patterson, Cassandra James, Marianne Perlmutter, Danielle Kreider, Sarah Chapman, Sandy Curry, and Alice Freed. And I think that's it. Hopefully I didn't miss anybody. So good. Great. That's fun. Okay, so that is the end of our formal meeting. I turn it over now to Rami Muth, and welcome Claudine Wong. Thanks for being patient.
Thank you.
Oh, one thing, Craig, I guess you're the host, or Danielle, when Claudine starts, can we make her expand her window? So right now I'm looking at 30 little images.
I should be able to spotlight her.
Okay, thanks.
Well, let's just begin by saying thank you to Niles. This is the culmination of your presidency, and we certainly appreciate all that you've done. We're going to, it's with great pleasure that I introduce our guest speaker, Claudine Wong. I've known Claudine since she was an 8th grade student in Venetia Middle School. And we're going to start with a brief introduction that's been pre-recorded and also a short video clip. And then immediately following, we'll have Claudine sharing her perspectives on an Asian American discrimination, harassment, and through her own personal journey. So Craig, if you would please cue up the video. There we go. Craig, I think we're having audio problems. Can we stop the video and just check? Can people hear?
No,
It's a little muted. I had to increase the volume on my.
Okay. All right. I'm sorry. Then go forward.
I could hear it fine.
Me too.
I'm not hearing anything.
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 All right.
I'm not hearing anything.
Based on that, Craig, would you mind starting over and then let's just double check on the audio?
It may be individuals speakers system have to be increased to the max. Some, not all are.
I've got mine on.
I know that the sound is coming through for many people, and it's coming through for me. So it may be individual, unfortunately.
Okay. Thanks, Craig.
And mine is fine.
I have no volume.
It's that. I don't want to do, I've never.
Claudine, I think you're on mute.
I keep trying to unmute. There we go. How is that? Here we go. So many computer problems, right? We've had over a year of the Zoom, and I would love to be sitting there in person with you guys, right? So we wouldn't have to worry about if anyone could hear. So I apologize for those who couldn't hear the piece. And so I'll try for those who didn't hear any of it to kind of just repeat some of the themes if I can during this talk. I want to thank Rami and Janice for reaching out to me and inviting me to this conversation. Thank you guys all for having me and wanting to listen. I think this is an interesting situation for me. For those who couldn't hear the video in the introduction, I have been a journalist for 25 years now, and I take that job very seriously, but that job is very specific to telling other people's stories. It is not about telling my own, and I don't think I've had much practice, if any, about doing that. It's not something I have done. It's not something I know if I was totally comfortable with, and this journey that people are going on right now is something that I've been going on through my entire life, trying to come to terms with this sense of belonging and not feeling like I've belonged anywhere. And that has been a reckoning for me. And it has gotten to this point here and where we are today that I am being asked to have this conversation, that I've had to really think about it and really think about what I want to say. So there are speeches, right, where we get in front of people, and I've got to do a high school graduation speech coming up in a couple of weeks, and that's going to be a speech, right? Thank you to all the graduates, congratulations, here's the world that you're entering, go get them, right? This today, though, as I've thought about it and I've tried to write things down, this I really hope is a conversation. I really hope that this is a place where, you know, I certainly don't speak for the entire AAPI community. Oh my goodness, no. But in news, what we do is we try to help part of that conversation by telling people stories and giving people a voice. So we introduce you to the people, whether they are inspiring business people or victims of a crime or the families of the victims. And we try to give you a piece of them that is deeper. We give you the who, the why, the what, the when, the where, but we give you a piece of them. So when we have numbers and statistics and things that we're seeing, we don't see those numbers and statistics, but we see people and we see each other and we see our community, because in that space is where we really have an impact and where we can start a conversation, as opposed to saying, here's what you should do. I mean, it would be great, right? With racism, if we could say, so if you don't do this and you don't say this, then woo, we're good. Work is done. That's just not what this is about, and it never has been. And the conversation that I'm having with you today is a conversation I've had with myself as I try to figure out how I accept myself and how I accept that people might never accept me. And that is something that it's beyond, if it was just the guy who attacked an elderly Asian person and we could just be mad at that guy or whoever that perpetrator is, be something. But when it's your friends and your coworkers and parents and when your children are targeted, it becomes complicated. And when people tell jokes and they don't mean it and they don't mean harm, what you didn't see in that piece, if you didn't hear this term ally, it's about several layers, right? Saying, I want to listen. And then saying, okay, let me actually do the listening and learn. And then there's one last layer, the ability to say, I don't really get it. Like someone explains it to you and you're like, I still don't really get it, but I respect it. That's the true tolerance, right? Saying, I may not ever totally understand what you are going through or what you're feeling. I may not totally agree that saying Oriental is hurtful. Doesn't bother me. I don't mean anything by it. But I'm going to listen and I'm going to say, where does that cause come from, and what does it lead to that I may not understand? I mean, I did a couple of recent stories where one was on Asian hate crimes, and people were like, oh my gosh, it's terrible. And then I did another story a short time later about how the words that we use can lead to this violence. And the response was, oh gosh, you guys are being so sensitive, you know, like, and it went on and on. And it was like the step where people said, okay, I don't like it, but it's the work that we do to say, even if I didn't mean it, what did I say that was hurtful? Or what did I say that led someone else who was going to be even more hurtful than I would ever be, gave them a pass to do that. So in a long drawn out way, what I just want to say is thank you for listening. I think the reason that I feel comfortable talking for the first time in my life is because for the first time, I feel like people are listening. And it took this very dark period in our history to get to a point where people want to listen. And so I hope that my journey will give you a face to some of what's going on. It'll give you a perspective of why some people feel the way they do and why it's been such a difficult time for the AAPI community, because it has been. It's been sad and lonely and scary. And it's been a place where that story, for those of you who could hear it and for those of you who couldn't, that I pitched to my station because I said, people don't really understand Asian American racism. They know they don't think it's right, but they don't understand it. And so I hope that this may bring some understanding. And I also hope that you guys have questions towards the end of this in anything you want to ask, because I think people are also scared to ask questions. They're scared to say the wrong thing. They're scared to do the wrong thing. And what happens is that no one talks then. And that becomes a harder place too. So I did have someone, the difference being someone on Facebook recently that I knew said, oh, why can't I say Oriental? And started this whole discussion about why he should get to, as a white male, should get to tell me what I get to be called because he gave me geography lessons, and not me particularly, you know, it's Facebook. And then I had someone else I was talking to about that post, and she said, okay, so I know I'm not supposed to say it, but why? And there was the difference in the conversation. It's not about, oh, we all know everything. It's about why. So I make sure that I understand why I'm not saying something. And that makes it feel less PC or less, oh, we just have to do this. It makes it say, okay, this is why I'm not saying it, and that's important. I should mention too, I mean, we're in a place, San Francisco, I looked it up. I knew it was about 30. It's like 35% of San Francisco is Asian American. So we here in the Bay Area feel like we see people that look like us all the time. Across the country, it's about 5.7%. So in my career, I've worked in Oregon and I've worked in Indiana, where I was the only Asian person there. And it's different. There's theory called contact theory, where you don't have any exposure to people who of a certain race. And so you determine how you think of them by the media and different things because there's just not exposure. And so working for 5 years in Indiana, it was an interesting time for me in that sense. So I'm just going to start. Let's start from the beginning, when Claudine was a baby, because that's, you know, I was born in Oakland, but I was really raised in San Francisco, and in San Francisco, 35% Asian American. I think for the early part of my life, I didn't feel very different. What I did feel different that I think is important is that my grandparents, I had both sets of grandparents that immigrated over from China. And in that piece that you guys, some saw and some didn't, they talked about the Chinese Exclusion Act, which said Chinese immigrants really had to prove that they were here and going to be contributing citizens. And they really came over with the sense of stay quiet and don't rock the boat so that you can bring your families over. And the history is very complex and complicated, but that lasted for decades. So I had two sets of grandparents who immigrated over. And actually I was going through my history, and actually their parents had already been over here, but they weren't allowed to bring families over here because of the Exclusion Act. So I'm technically third generation, but I could have been fourth had they been allowed to bring anyone over. And I had one set of grandparents who would not let me speak any Chinese around them because they didn't want me to face racism. So I was told not to speak Chinese, only to speak English. And I had another set of grandparents who really wanted me to value my culture and what they brought over, and they wanted me to only speak Chinese. It was very confusing. And they would walk me around San Francisco Chinatown and apologize that we didn't and blame my parents, because that's what we do. It was their fault. I'm a good kid. My parents didn't teach me Chinese. And I grew up with this sense that I didn't really quite fit in the Chinese community. So this sense of this perpetual foreigner, that you should just go back to China, and you didn't right there. Well, if you don't speak the language and you're growing up American and your parents grew up American, then how is it that people think that we could just, turn around and pop back over there, right? So there was already that sense of, within the Asian community, where do I fit in? I lived in San Francisco until 5th grade, and then I moved out to Benicia, Benicia Middle School, where Rami ended up being my teacher. And I think I babysat for Janice. But it was Benicia where there was an Asian population, but not a Chinese population. And there are like many different countries, right, classified under Asian American 20+. And we don't all, see each other and feel this bond. And I felt very alone. And in 6th grade, I had gone from an all-girls private school in San Francisco to, a public school that was massive from where I stood, and co-ed, and it was very scary. And this was in the time of 16 Candles. And this group of boys chased after me after school one day. I didn't have any friends, I don't think that. And they were laughing and they were yelling long duck dong, chong, ching chong, and everything that you could think of. And they backed me into a corner, and I just remember them laughing and laughing. And I dropped some expletives, which made them go away. And I went home and I cried. And I never really introduced myself with my last name after that, because Wong opened yourself up to a lot of that. That was probably the first profound instance of racism that I felt, although there were other parts for my family that they went through that played out. And then it was little things. They use this term microaggressions when they're talking about racism, and I think that's hard for people to understand. They're tiny little spaces, right? So if one microaggression happened, then maybe you wouldn't notice. But when they happen again and again and again and again, I remember going to a friend's house to spend the night, and she was a brand new person to the neighborhood and a brand new friend to me. And I woke up and I heard her mom on the phone, and she was like, "Oh, she's like a little China doll." And I never went back to that house because I felt unseen. And so that, by its own space, maybe not a big deal, but then it kept happening. It was the people who said me and the other Chinese guy in high school, I won't call him that right now, very nice guy, would make the cutest couple because we were both the only Chinese guys in town. It was the time that I sat in a car with my friends and these guys they liked, and I was listening to the music, and it was this white supremacy music. And I was like, what are we listening to? And they turned around and they said, "Well, it's okay, Claudine, because you're our friend." And I said, "Does that mean you gave me a pass because I'm not white?" They're like, "Yeah, you're fine as long as you're with us." And then there was the time when, I knew that a friend of mine would not let people of color in her house, but I was allowed in her house. And then I had to wonder where that line was drawn. Does it mean that I could hang out with their daughter, but I couldn't date her brother? Like, at what point? And when it comes to that space around you in this place, when it's your friends groups and the other, everyone in your life, whether it's the people who love you and the people who are taking you in and the people for me, there's this term assimilation. I just wanted to be like everyone else. And when the ideal was the white, blonde girl that I would never be, it didn't matter that I was class president, and it didn't matter that I had teachers who supported me, and it didn't matter that, I was a good student or I tried. It mattered that I knew I would never quite get there. And what you do with that space is difficult. So all I did was want to get out. And I got into UCLA, and which I was told at that time, and I was a good student. I had over a 4.0. I did very well on my ACTs, and I was in leadership and did all that, blah, 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 blah. So I thought, I went to UCLA, in which even then I was told that I only got in because I was Asian. You know, they called, when I went there, the University of Caucasians Lost Among Asians was the joke that they would say it, and they would, everything had a turn to it, everything spun it. So when people say, oh, you always bring race into it, or it's always brought in for me wherever I go. I tell my husband, I said, if there are 100 people in the room and one of them is racist, they will find me, they will come over, they will seek me out, and somewhere in my space, that's where they'll be. So when I got to UCLA, even, I didn't know where I fit in there too. This sense of belonging, it's profound. And you talk about kids today when they talk about mental health and where their spaces and where their safe spaces. I got there and I felt comfortable in my sorority that I joined. And I remember sitting there with a girl and she said, you know, we're super diverse. And I said, well, are we? And I'm like, there's 110 women in this house and I can count the number of minorities on one hand. My choice to join them, and that lovely group of women who are still friends with mine today and great friends. But I'm like, that's not what I would call diverse. And keep in mind, this is all UCLA and very diverse population. And I said to her, and I put it this way, I said, if you came down to this kitchen, we have this huge kitchen, all these big tables, and we'd eat breakfast there. It was great. Like, I had such a great time. But I said, if you came down into this dining room tomorrow and everyone at every table was Asian, what would you do? She's like, I'd probably leave. I'm like, right. I'm like, because no one in the room would look like you. I said, that's every morning for me. I'm like, every day I do that. I walk in and no one looks like me. And people make fun of my food, or they, you know, do something, and not in that space, but just in general. And I said, that's the difference, is that there's no expectation of the discomfort that you might feel. Like, that's the world that I live in, and that's the world I have to be comfortable in. And even in those spaces, there's always, and you'll hear the AAPI community talk about this, the what are you, where are you from? And the conversation always goes, oh, where are you from? I'm like, oh, you know, San Francisco, Benicia. No, I mean, where are you from? I'm like, the Bay Area. No, what are you? I'm like, what do you mean, what am I? And where were you born? I'm like, Oakland. I mean, where were your parents born? San Francisco. Well, you know what I mean? Yes, we all know what you mean, but we get tired of being asked, because, I mean, at this point, I've never even been to China. I'd like to go, but I just haven't been. So why is it, and I would ask people who are not minorities to see how many people have asked you what your heritage is on a daily basis or a weekly basis. Like, it just, we're all proud of it, I think, but to be defined by it is something different. And then I had this moment, and this was a very profound moment for me. At the end of my sophomore year, I went to Europe, and I went there for school. I went to Greece and Turkey and studied, because it seemed amazing to be able to get credit while being in Europe, and it was amazing. And the thing that struck me partway through the trip, because then I backpacked through Europe after that, was that everywhere I went, everywhere, without fail, people assumed I was an American. They could tell from forever away. Nobody, not a single person there thought I was a Chinese national that had come over from China. Everyone's like, oh, American? And I said, how is it? And it was this moment, I said, how is it that everyone here can tell I'm an American, but I go to America and everyone questions it? And then I thought, at the age of 19, I said, where in the world can I go where I'll ever be truly accepted, that someone will ever believe that I belong there? And I couldn't think of a place, that there's nowhere on this planet that I would go where someone wouldn't question if I was allowed to be there. And it was like a wave of loneliness that crashed over me. And there was nowhere to go. I mean, I have decided that maybe Hawaii, but I'm not Hawaiian, so that probably doesn't work. But it's a nice place to try to fit in, because they do treat me like a local in Hawaii, even though I am not local. But it was sad. I was really sad for a long time. And I think when I think about how I felt as a 19-year-old girl who wanted to be optimistic about the world, and I've always been very idealistic in that space, I think that was a turning point, that I couldn't find that place. Because if you live in the Bay Area and you can't find it in the Bay Area, where else do you think you could go? And so that has been difficult. Like someone had asked me the other day, they said, have you talked about, you know, everything that you're going through with your mom? I'm like, well, it's nothing really to talk about. It just is. Like, there's no solution. There's no, it just is. And part of it is acceptance and moving forward. I'm hesitant to show this video about media. Simply, it was one more video we want to show because not everyone can hear. So I think I might skip it. I don't know, Romy, what do you think? Because I don't want people to sit and,
Personally, I would rather you skip it if you don't mind.
I don't mind at all.
We'll make it available on our website. You know, the introduction with the video is available that way, so people can be able to hear
Perfect.
it. But I think, as you
I
say,
don't want people to be sitting in 4 minutes of silence.
watching.
Or maybe all of them. They may need a break from me, but so I want to transition, and some of the media is important in that story if people have a time to go back and look at it, because I think how I defined myself and really how my brother and my sister, and I don't really want to share stories about them only because I feel like everyone has their own story to tell and it's their decision to tell it. But I interviewed the director of Crazy Rich Asians, who's from the Bay Area. His name's John M. Chu, and he talked about that movie and how pivotal it was. And really, it was for so many people that I've talked to who've never seen themselves in a positive light on a screen. If you can try to rack your brain for an Asian American character, and specifically a male one who has been portrayed well, there is a saying that says you can't be what you can't see. And if you never see yourself in a positive light, or at the very base level of someone desired by, you know, in a romantic way or in a relationship in that way, you know, or for women, not hypersexualized, where you're just some kind of like, oh, you're into Asians kind of thing. And that's really the only way we saw ourselves, in bit parts and small parts and characters. There was a new study by USC that just talked about how 95% of Asian characters are killed in a violent way in Hollywood, like in movies. So if there is an Asian character, the likelihood that they die and by violence is high. And so sociologists will tell you that that plays into it. Now, as I look back at it, I'm telling stories about this and this and this, but I look back into who I was at 22 when I also graduated from UCLA and took my job as a reporter, what that meant and how I felt about myself, and how I still didn't really have a sense of pride and a place to stand and 2 feet to stand on in a way that was positive, I think. In the professional world, my first job, I got to tell you, was Oregon. And I thought, okay, I'm still on the West Coast, right? I'll be in good shape. I think they're adult to adult. When people say things to kids, or when kids say things to kids, or when you're growing up, it's one thing. In Oregon, I remember a coworker said to me that if I had children with my then boyfriend, who was white, is white, he wasn't, was, he is, he just wanted to give me some advice. He said, don't have children. He goes, I think it's fine if you guys stay together. And this was actually someone who probably was, he's in a different department, but you know, he had been there longer, and I was basically a kid in my first job making $7 an hour, didn't know what I was doing. And he said, don't have kids. And I said, why? And he said, I wouldn't want you to taint his blood with yours. He said it well-meaning. He said it looking out for my children. He said he had Native American in his background and he always felt dirty. And I don't know if I don't know what I said. I'm trying to think back to what I said, but at that time, he wasn't the only coworker. I mean, I went to speak at a college for Diversity Week. They didn't actually have a strong Asian American population up there. And so they asked me to speak. And I remember my coworker taunting me as I left the room. I said, I have to go to this speech. He goes, oh, are you going to talk about how the white man put you down? And then he told me, he goes, you people have gotten more opportunity in this country than you would have gotten anywhere else. And I remember turning around, I said, did you just say you people? And I said, the point is, people have gotten more opportunity in this country than they would have gotten. All of us as Americans have gotten more opportunity. You didn't give this to me as my coworker. You didn't give me this right. I'm a third generation American here, and I shouldn't even have to explain that to you. He wasn't the only one. It wasn't the only time. But I think back to things back then is it's not like I went to my boss. I didn't assume anything would be done. It's not like no, that's not true. I told my supervisor every day. I would call him like, I quit. I can't work here. And he'd laugh. We'd laugh because it was accepted as people say things. And that's just a part of it. And when I was leaving that market, I was told, well, you can't go to this other place because they don't accept Asians there, and you can't go to this place. And so these places off limits for me in the country. They're like, they're not going to treat you well. And I just said, okay. So I ended up in Indiana, which I didn't know anything about the Midwest, to be honest, but I was open. And I always said I grew up kind of sheltered in the opposite way. I thought even with everything I'd experienced, I could handle it. I was told by a coworker there that I wasn't a minority because I passed for white, which I've never been mistaken for being white. I was told I only got the job because I was Asian, because the station across the street hired an Asian American reporter. So I was just the response to that. I've been told throughout my career, asked if I was Connie Chung or Christy Yamaguchi or Michelle Kwan or whoever was the Asian American of note at the time, because no one could tell me apart. I was told not to do kung fu on people. I was told, and these are random people walking down the street. And my joke in my newsroom was, I would say, you guys would tell Asian jokes if you knew any, but they didn't even have an Asian American population. And so it was actually in some ways easier, because when I got back to the Bay Area, and I was so excited to come back. At one point, I had just moved back to San Francisco, and I had walked down the street and I looked at a fire truck driving by, and the engineer who was driving was an Asian American man. And I released this, I think I teared up, because it had been so long since I looked around and saw people who looked like me. 5 years is a long time and I didn't really know how much that would impact me, but it reminds me of how people who live in areas like that are impacted in those spaces when no one speaks for you, no one understands what you're going through, and you just live in that space and you accept it. You know, and even here in the Bay Area, former coworkers, and these are all former coworkers, so there's no one I'm currently working with, have told me to go back to China, have told Wong jokes days on end, thinking they're funny, have explained to me why I should just laugh and why I take it too seriously. And I think at the end of it, I did accept a lot of it. You know, I mean, I think in the video too, that some of you couldn't see, I laughed it off, because what are you going to do when you turn around and you take a stand against this person and you face the next person the next day, and you just want to live in your space, and you don't almost want to acknowledge it because people also don't take it seriously. I've had people tell me multiple times, you're not a minority. I don't see you that way. At 5% of this country, if we just go by math, we are statistically a minority. But I think if we bring back to 2021 and where we got to the place that you've asked me to do this talk today, I think, you know, I'm not 22 anymore. Don't do that math, but I say I'm a defiant minority now, because now it affects my children, and it affects my parents, and it affects me. When I went on a hike and I was like, and I told my husband, I said, now I don't have to, like women, I say, you know, I never run alone. I've covered too many stories of people running alone. I don't run alone. I'm always thoughtful about my safety as a female alone. But now I look at people and I wonder, I'm like, are you going to take a swing at me on sight, unprovoked? Because that's what's been happening. And I say, you know, my silence and my laughing it off has not helped. And there is guilt within people I've talked to about, should we have said something earlier? Should we have done something earlier? Should we have, and would have anyone listened? And I don't think they would have. But I do think, and I said this to someone, I said, I do have a chip on my shoulder, if I'm honest, but it's been ground in over years. You know, I went to a wedding and I sat down and the person turned to me and he just said, Konnichiwa. I'm like, okay, well, I'm not Japanese, but hi. And then he started trying out every Asian hello. And I'm like, well, I am American. You can just say hi, and that's fine. People, he wasn't trying to be rude. It's so rude. And so I struggle these days. You know, I told my mom, she said the other day she was, and I said I wasn't going to tell stories, but I'll tell this one story about my mom. And she's like, I was in Costco the other day and some man was just staring at me. And I just looked at him and I said, can I help you? My mom is 5 feet tall. She's less than 100 pounds. She's tiny, but don't mess with her. And I said to her, I'm like, is it because ignoring it isn't working? She's like, it doesn't work anyway. She's like, if they're going to hit me, they're going to hit me anyway. And I was proud of her and I'm sad. I'm sad because I thought maybe my mom wouldn't have to worry about things like this. And I wish that she didn't. And I wish that I felt more hopeful that at not the age of 22 than I do feel today. So what gives me hope though is that people ask. It gives me hope that people talk. It gives me some sense that people who are listening now might gain an understanding that they didn't have before. Because a lot of what we talk about when I talk about coworkers, not all of them are these racist people who were trying to hurt my feelings or who were trying to hurt me. They just don't know why it's not funny. And they don't know why what they say is hurtful. And they don't know what it feels like to never feel like you belong, and how when someone has that wound, those little things that you say are salt. It is one more reminder that you don't quite fit and that you might never fit if it was up to some people. It is about, and I don't know what the solution is. And I wish I did. I said, I'm like, maybe we shouldn't say Asian American anymore. Maybe we should say an American of Asian descent, trying to fight that foreigner vibe. Maybe we should have an explainer on why China doll and telling someone she looks like a doll and an inanimate object while they mean it well is not nice. We need to maybe explain the model minority concept to people if you don't understand or you haven't been familiarized with that concept. It is that sense of, if I go back to the immigration we talked about, it was that sense of these Chinese immigrants saying, we are going to be, you know, quiet. We're just going to do our thing and keep our head down. And that sense that people have said this, why don't you act like the Asians? They don't put up a fuss. Someone said that to me in college at UCLA. She said, well, the Asian Americans don't make a fuss. Why can't more of the minority groups be like you? Which pits minority groups against each other to say, why do we have to be like each other? And we don't have to be like each other. And being silent, I think, has not helped. And it doesn't make me feel like I belong. And it makes me feel silenced. So, you know, I responded to someone on Facebook, which I really rarely do, on someone else's post about my Asian friends laughed. And I said, in this space, we need to stop asking our Asian American friends, is this okay if I say this? And we should do what we do for every point in our life and ask us, is this something that if it doesn't bother 2 people, but it bothers 8, even if I don't understand, is that something that I want to do in that place where I want to be? Is that the compassion I want to show? Is that these steps that you can't walk in my shoes. But they're sometimes very hard shoes to walk in, and I am proud now in a way that I wasn't as a child. I am proud of every generation that came before me that fought to be here. I am proud of every part of me that is American. Someone asked me at the station, they're like, describe what being Asian American is. I'm like, it's being an American. It's what we all are. We all have history and stories to tell. Just not all of us can have that history and stories be judged by the color of our skin but we all have it. So being an American, that is the shared experience, right? It is, but it is recognizing that because we are different, because we are together, we can see it differently. You know, I did a story on Mr. Ju's in San Francisco, which is a Michelin-starred restaurant in Chinatown. And he was saying too, he's like, I don't make Chinese food. I make Chinese American food. He's like, he's third generation like me. He's like, oh, I wasn't born in China. I don't have that palate. I have an American palate that likes Asian flavors. And that's what I make. We have to recognize that. We have to talk about it. We have to be willing to have these conversations, and they're uncomfortable. Like, this is brutal for me. I usually talk for like a few minutes and I talk about other people. And this is hard for me. But I hope that if we don't talk, right? If we talk at each other, if we get defensive, if we don't learn, then that's where we run into some problems. And that's where we get our feelings hurt. And I know it's hard. I mean, it's hard for me. When I was telling someone the other day, I said in the 80s, we said a lot of terrible things. And it wasn't just on race. It was on mental health, and it was on disabilities. And we said terrible things, and they were accepted. And we didn't necessarily mean to be terrible when we said them, but that makes them not less terrible, right? And so I think about the kid I was who said a lot of hurtful things, maybe not to other Asian people, but in other ways, in words that I know I'm no longer supposed to say, but I try to learn why I'm not supposed to say it in terms that would be better. And I try to have the grace to understand that if I'm hoping for people to give me that I give it to other people who are learning as well when it comes to my journey and the shoes that I have walked in and the experiences that I have had. Of 1,000 tiny stories that I could tell that horrify people, but are my normal. And it just is. But it doesn't always have to be, I guess, is the big part of that. I really hope that if you guys have questions, that we can maybe answer some of them now, that we can have more of a conversation, because I hope that that's what this can be. You know, and I hope that if we weren't all sitting in separate rooms, that that's what it would be, that someone sharing and talking would be where we have that space, and maybe a safer space than we've had to say, well, what is and what is not, what we shouldn't say. Then that would be important. You know, I mean, I think that's part of it. You know, I think what you guys are doing, this whole group of people that has come together, you guys are obviously people who take charge, right? You see something, you want to help, and you sign up. Not everyone, right? Like, we know that it's always kind of the same people who sign up sometimes to do stuff, but this is where change starts, right? With a group of people. Well, here's a question. All right. A simple statement that alerts folks that you are resistant to their racist wordings. It's difficult sometimes to find out when you want to have that discussion, right? The person who posted, I can say Oriental because of this, I didn't respond to. Other people did, because it goes back to that saying of, I don't really believe in talking unless people are listening, right? And so the person who asked me why they shouldn't say Oriental, I explained, you know, it's a region and people trying to not feel objectified, and we don't do that for any other region, right? We don't call someone Mediterranean, we're saying they're Italian or they're European, we don't do that. She's like, oh, I didn't think about them like that way. We call food and material objects, and there's a long history of us trying not to be objectified as Asian Americans. But she was asking. So this is why this is such an important group for me, right? If you're listening, then those are the people you start with, right? Sometimes, this is the other thing. So there's a teenager who said, you know, in my family, who was called a racial slur, and someone else said, well, you need to speak up. And I maintained, I said, no, they don't until they're ready. Because it's unfair to ask people to stand on the line until they're ready to stand on the line, in my viewpoint. I said, I'll stand on that line for him until he's ready. because it's already unfair. So to make someone feel like they can raise the sword is unfair. What I do think helps is that if you're not a person of color and you hear something that someone else says and you speak up, that is powerful. Not only does it tell the person who is the victim of that racism that someone else cares, but it also avoids I have gotten so many times that you are so sensitive. I was just kidding, right? Because they think I'm taking it too personally. I'm just, sensitive. Oh, Claudine's pulling the race card. That happens a lot. And people don't want to be told that, right? But if you say something and say, you know what, that's not okay, you shouldn't say that. Sometimes it's also more received. Sometimes it's not, it's not a direct thing. It's more of a checking each other within the non-minority community to say, we're the majority here. Maybe this is something we should think about. And it's less of a direct attack. People really don't like to be told that they're doing something, especially if they don't mean any malice behind it. They don't like to be told that something they did was hurtful. They get very defensive of it, I find, because people, if they don't mean anything by it, they don't want to feel bad. None of us want to feel bad, right? So this next question, if as a white person talking to minorities, it's not to bring up race unless they do. So I think there are no rules. You just have to be open to asking a question that they may not want to answer, they may want to answer. So if you have a question, but I think people get sensitive when especially in these times, when they're told, right? Like when you're told about an issue of race, and it's not, during Black Lives Matter and during Stop Asian Hate, there's this conversation where people are like, oh, you called your one Black friend or you called your one Asian friend and you asked them a question. You have to make sure that one Asian friend wants to answer your question, because they can't just be the source because you need one, right? You have to find the one Asian friend who is open to the discussion, because like I said at the start of this, I don't want to be I don't have all the answers. I only have my experience and my perspective, and it's just one part of it, which goes back to that other space. So I think it depends on your friend, and it depends on that person who is a minority, and it depends on if they have opened the door for you to ask them about something, or and I think you have to be open. I think people in general, right, with anything that we're experts on, anything that we individually as people have some kind of basis for, whether it's any kind of experience that other people might not be familiar with. It could be a friend who has, an illness, or a child who has a disability, or whatever. We feel like we have some basis of knowledge for that. And when people talk to us about it, we feel like they should ask us instead of tell us what they should know. So I think that's something, that's important. The next comment was on Oriental. Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of those things. I used to, before all of this, put people in compartments, right? Like, so in Oregon, like this woman was in an elevator. She was older, senior, who's carried her air tank with her. And she just looked up at me and she's like, Orientals do good things. And I said, well, thank you. We try very hard. But she was older and she meant nothing by it. She just was trying to be nice. And so I'm not going to say, you can't say that word anymore. I just smiled at her and I moved on. Again, it's the discussions you want to have and you don't want to have. So, so is there a non-racist way to ask someone about the culture traditions? So I think if someone celebrates the cultural traditions, you can ask them about them, but you should never assume that they do celebrate them. So I think that's the line. It's not racist to ask someone about culture. It is racist to assume, based on just looking at them, that they would be an expert on culture or experience any of that culture. Like in my family, my parents, so people used to say like, oh my God, Joy Luck Club, did you love that movie? And I'm like, well, it's not, I'm like, yeah, but I don't, it's not like it was like my story, but they all, I mean, so many people said that to me. Oh my gosh, join that club. I'm like, well, my parents didn't immigrate over, their parents did. And so maybe it's more something they relate to. I don't know. And so each of us, depending on how many generations we've been here, and in that story that some of you heard, some of you didn't, you know, like the head of the Chinese Historical Society of America was saying, he's like, yeah, since the 1800s, we've been here since in Chicago. Like that's, so, or there are people who are very traditional and really want to talk about it. So I think it's just not assuming. You can ask, you can say, how traditional is your family? Or do you celebrate Chinese New Year, or don't you? Or, I think it's this assumption that we are all the same and that we all celebrate it the same way, and that we all, and we are all different, right? So some people are very traditional in their households and some people aren't. I think you just have to ask instead of assume. Racially sensitive education in our schools. So, well, this is a complicated one, right? And it's certainly complicated, especially if we want to go into the general news of this critical race theory and how all that is blowing up. This is what I think about every industry. It is important to have diversity in your educators, because educators can weigh in on this. This is why in newsrooms as well, it's important to have diversity in newsrooms, not just because so when people look at it, they see people look like them on TV. That's part of it, but it's also because we look at stories in different ways. Because I lament over, should we say Americans of Asian descent, or should we say, when we say just Asian, are we just making them not Americans? What should we do? I don't have the right answer, but I certainly think about it a lot. I don't know if my coworker does as well. I'm pretty sure they don't. I literally lose sleep over it because I can't figure out how to not be a part of the problem. I want to be a part of the solution. And so how, as an Asian American journalist, can I fix that and help that, or at least not add to it? And so that I don't have the answer, but I know I lament over it, right? So an educator is the same, I think, in our schools. There's no book that's going to solve this. There's no one way to teach this that's going to solve this. But I can tell you as a journalist, when I cover stories, and I did something with an Oakland school and compared it to how they taught in Walnut Creek. In Oakland, I walked into this middle school and they had a class for African-American male students. Of course, anyone could join it, but it was African-American male students in Oakland. And I walked into that class and the teacher was teaching those kids what they should do if ever they got pulled over by a police officer. How not to have their hoodie and how not to, and the teacher was like, I don't want these kids to die. I don't want these kids to die. And so I'm going to teach them in this class. And that school prioritized it because they had a large African-American population. They had a teacher who was willing to teach that. And they had a space where they thought they literally could save the lives of these children. They teach that same class, Kingmakers, and they teach it in Antioch and Pittsburgh. They do not teach it in Benicia. They do not teach it in Walnut Creek. They do not teach it in, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they have to teach it in all those communities, but it does mean that if you have a teacher who has an experience that someone else doesn't have, you can't have an education, it's kind of like male teachers, right? They offer a different perspective than female teachers, and teachers of color offer different experiences. And there's students who may have trouble. When I shared one of those experiences from middle school, I did have teachers from middle school reach out and say, I would have helped you and I would have done something. Why didn't you tell me? And maybe if it had been someone who looked like me, I would have felt more comfortable saying it. I don't know, maybe I wouldn't have, but no one did look like me, and I didn't believe anyone would understand it. And so there is that space of saying diversity is important in every aspect of what we do, because we bring different perspectives to the table from wherever we came from and and if our educators are willing to listen to the people around them, they become better advocates for the children that they represent as well. So I don't know if it's just not as simple. It's not a textbook. It's not reading this book or that book. It's about having people that can maybe say, I get it on some level. And maybe they don't get it, right? Just because you have an Asian teacher doesn't mean they would get my experience, or that's the other problem, right? Just because we're both Asian doesn't mean that we bond, right? So when I say, you know, we need to have one, it just increases the likelihood, but it certainly doesn't guarantee anything. And that's why the conversation is so important among everybody. It can't just be you give the Asian students, you know, like I have a friend I worked with and we were talking about this with all the stuff. And she said when she went to Boston for college, they had a separate orientation for the Asian American students. And I was talking to someone about it, like outrage. I was like, she had to come a day early, pay to stay in this dorm, and it was only for the Asian American students. And a friend of mine who's from Boston, he goes, well, to be fair, Claudine, they have a lot of, you know, international students coming over from China. And I'm like, she's from Hawaii. Like, what? Like, it wasn't an international student orientation. It was an Asian student orientation. I'm like, that's horrible, because already the first step she takes into that college, and she came from Hawaii, so she was coming far away. They were like, you get to hang out with these folks over here because you guys all look alike, so you must all want to be friends. Even though they were raised in different countries, spoke different languages, had different experiences, and she was more like the kids from Boston as an American than the kids from Asia, but because they looked alike, let's put them all in the same room and put them through orientation together. And so things are done. I'm sure the folks at that school were like, hey, here's a great idea, but that's just not how it works. So that kind of, it is as we make assumptions, we have to stop ourselves from saying that. We have to, and I do that too. Like I do that when I say, okay, what do I do? You know, like you'll talk to African-American people who say that women clutch their bags closer, you know, when they come near them, right? I have a lot of friends, Black men, who say they don't walk alone because people are scared of them, or they only walk with their children or their wives so that people don't see them as a threat. And I said, but they don't do that with me. I'm like, they talk really loudly and slowly to me. Like, how long have, you know, and they never assume that I speak English. And I wish I spoke Chinese, but I don't. And so someone told me, a former boss said, he's like, your accent isn't terrible. I'm like, my accent, because I speak only English. I'm like, that's good. So I think that's it. I wish there were easy solutions, right? Then maybe we wouldn't have this problem now. But the reality is that it's never been easy. And this is a baby conversation. I mean, this is a new conversation for a lot of people. They just haven't talked about it. And within the AAPI community, a lot of us have talked about how we haven't talked about it. And even now when people are like, what? And so they get behind the slogan of Stop Asian Hate, but they don't really understand what that means, because the experience hasn't been as well known. It is a small group, right? A small population. You'll find small minority populations are a big part of that. The question, how much influence do stereotypes of minorities in the media have in continuing discrimination? Huge, huge. And I did a story on this, and I think they'll link it, but it's huge in a way that I didn't really understand until as an adult. And I look back and going back to that Crazy Rich Asians movie, John M. Chu, he said his brother cried when he saw the main character walk across the stage because he had never seen an Asian male lead look like that. And they're all jokes, you know? I mean, they're all jokes about Asian people. The accent is never desirable. People treat Asian American characters like they're stupid. The Long Duck Dong character was traumatic to so many Asian American men and boys. And if you think about it, and this is the thing, it's not that character exists. Like the analogy the sociologist talked about is true. If you take Breakfast Club, if you guys remember that movie, it wasn't that there was a white nerdy character, because there was a white nerdy character, a white jock character, a white bad boy character, so someone who was white watching that movie wouldn't associate themselves with that one character. They could pick whoever they thought they were most like, you know, like there's all this goes, which Golden Girl are you? Which Friends character are you? Because there's so many different characters. But with Asian American characters, and this is what, like, I'm a big Crazy Rich Asians fan because of this movie. And so I use that as an example a lot, and people have used that, is that in that movie as well, people just happened to be Asian, and they were all sorts of spaces in there. But John M. Chu, the director, said all those actors, they were so fantastic because they've all been stars waiting in the wings. They've never been able to get a role that has been a lead. And Hollywood has always said, well, we don't have any lead actors, but they don't create lead actors among the Asian American actors. They put them in bit roles, and they say, well, they can't carry a movie like a Matt Damon or a, you know, whichever actor you're going to pick. And that's where, when you can't see what you can't be, then that is the problem. And that I've never seen myself, and that's why everyone picks Connie Chung or Michelle Kwan, because we don't have that many people to say, and then they stereotype us all that we should all know martial arts and that we should all be ice skaters, you know, and we are all not. People often treat seniors as stereotypes. Is the next question in the greeting cards for older people are making fun of older adults. And it's true. I mean, this is my point with everything we do, like how we translate, how we look at how we treat people is the same, assuming things about people that we shouldn't assume because of the way it makes them feel. And we make jokes and we make people feel small based on them. And when that stereotype is negative, right? Like people would say to me, and this is the other part I would say too, is that each experience is unique. The feeling someone has being stereotyped as a senior is unique to that specific space. The feeling I have as an Asian American cannot be translated to the feeling that someone has as a Black American in this country. And we have this tendency to always go, well, I know how that feels because of this. It's okay that we don't know how it feels. You know, my husband is not Chinese, and he said, you know, I want to get it. And I said, it's important for you just to acknowledge that you don't, because it minimizes it if you try to say that you do, because he could divorce me and abandon and go off and go to part of the country and completely absolve himself of this minority experience that he is married into. No matter where he goes, I am still me. And that doesn't go away. It doesn't change. It doesn't get different. It just is. And that is profound. And it's okay that he doesn't get it. As long as he knows he doesn't get it, because that's respect that he gives in that space to say, I don't get it. Tell me what I'm not getting. And even the other day he said, so when I was on that hike and I was walking and I was wondering if that guy was going to hit me, like a poor guy, like he's just walking by me. But, you know, my husband said, he goes, don't you think I would have defended you? And I'm like, it's not about you. It's not about your chivalry. It's not about what you would have done. Stop making it about you. It's about that I have to even think about it. And I've already thought about it for so long in my life. You're a good guy, but stop making it, you know, like that's, and he didn't, and to his credit, he's always really taken everything and learned. But I'm like, he's been around it for many, many years. We went to high school together. So I've known this guy for a long time, but his experience grows as mine grows, and only as much as I'll share, because it's only sometimes I share when I can share, when I can process and I'm not angry or I'm not scared or I'm not in that space. So, you know, I really do appreciate you guys even listening for this long. But I hope that may help, that it's a, you know, I'm looking at the clock and I don't want to keep people longer than they were planning to Zoom. But I do hope that maybe somewhere in this space, it has helped in just the conversation and being not afraid to ask questions or acknowledge that we don't get it sometimes for other people's experiences, but we want to understand and we want to be compassionate and we want to be a part of the change. I have come to terms that I will not get to the end of this path. I'm not going to solve this for my children or even their children, but I'm going to put some pebbles on the path in the hopes that those next steps will be a little bit easier. They're going to still have some hard ones. And I hope that that groups like this one and that people in general continue to be willing to listen, because that's the only way that we have change. So thank you so much.
Claudine, I just, from the bottom of my heart, I want to thank you. I was one of those teachers that I was sitting here thinking to myself, why didn't I know? And what could I have done? But that said, I just want to say thank you for the courage that you've shown tonight in sharing this story. I'm sorry, but
Oh, well, I appreciate that compassion. It means a lot. And I know as an adult that people wanted to help, and I appreciate that you did. I also know, and I think about this with my own children, there's no getting around that I had to build steel in my spine for the life that I would live. And I'm better for that. And I'm proud. And I appreciate those sentiments very much.
I really believe we're at an inflection point in our world today. And this conversation is the beginning of that for many of us here. It has been true that silence has been deafening, that quiet stillness when we need to speak needs to change. We talk about what it means to be an ally. One of the things that we're going to be sharing in just a moment is training from an organization called I Holler Back. And it's about how anti-bystander, how we each have a place in all of this. And, not everybody is confrontational by nature, and there's a safety factor you just described. But in this training, one of the things that they share are strategies, tools for how we can lift our voice when we see things that are simply wrong. And for a long time, I think, kind of turned my eye away. I can't say what others have done. Maybe some folks think, well, that's not my fight. But I want to use the words of Dr. Martin Luther King, who said, a threat to justice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And if we don't lift our voice, we are part of that problem. So thank you for opening this dialogue, for being courageous enough to share your story in all of its implications for each of us. And I know that, all of us appreciate the time and energy. You're in Hawaii, for God's sake, you're on vacation. And yet you took the time to do this. And really, from the bottom of my heart, I thank you on behalf of the League of Women Voters. And we will be posting the link to this training for those that may be interested. It's free. It's an hour of your time. And for me, what I realized that there were many different ways in which I can become a true ally, not to stand on the side, but rather to engage in a way that is meaningful. I think that's part of the path forward. There is a path forward.
I agree. And I think that honestly, when you hear other people stand up for you when it's not their fight, it is profound when they take it on as their fight. And so I would encourage people who said, how can I help? Not only can you educate yourself in that space, but when something is wrong, when it feels wrong, when someone shouldn't say it. And it is hard to stand up. So not everyone can do it, but when you can, for the people who watch you and say that person stood up and it wasn't their fight because they just knew it was wrong, it's profound. It's powerful to say someone else sees me, even though they don't look like me, they see me. And that will give me hope for the children who are being raised in this world today, to say people see us, they hear us, and it's not their fight and they're fighting still. So I would agree that it's everyone's fight, the world we live in, and if it's a better, more welcoming, more loving, more accepting place, the diversity enriches all of our lives. So thank you.
Thank you. And my parting words to everybody is our theme, if you will, our motto from the League of Women Voters is democracy is not a spectator sport. And maybe we've been sitting on the sidelines a little too long. Time to stand up, be counted. Thank you, Claudine.
Thank you.
Thank you, Claudine. That was great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
But that marks the end of our meeting tonight. I want to thank Claudine for being here. I want to welcome the new board, and it seems like I'm passing the baton at just the right moment.
Congrats to the new board, yes.
Yeah, right. Anybody else have any passing from the board? Any other thoughts or comments you want to? Nope. We'll wrap it up then. Okay.
Thank you.
That's all, folks.
Thank you.
That's all. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Wow.
So we're ending the meeting, I think, right?
Yeah.
Okay, good. All right.
Job, Niles.
Yep,
Good job.
thanks.
Thank
See
you.
ya.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, yeah.
Job, Ron.
Great.